LOK Publishing presents Conspiracy in Kildath. Untold Tales of Kalda, Short Story 2. By Dan Zangari and Robert Zangari. Author's Foreword. The perspective of Zanxsthy'll is no stranger to us. He has been around for almost 20 years and was one of Robert's earliest contributions to the Legends of Kalda universe. He was also one of the first perspectives we wrote from, beside Ilter and Corner during the original publications of Tales of the Amulet. Although we had written from his perspective before, unlike the other point-of-view characters in this collection, we thought Zanxsthy'll a proper lens for readers to see the Zanxsthy'll. If you've read A Prince's Errand, you will have already seen Zanxsthy'll in action. No, we won't tell you who. Why should we rob you of the discovery? Anyway, that particular character is not like Zanxsthy'll. In fact, that character even claims as much. So, we decided to give you a clear view from the character who personified the original idea. The plot for this particular short story came to Robert in a dream several years ago. Many of the visuals were present in that dream, particularly the trident's wellspring in the altar of Chezrith. Part of that imagery was used in the companion story, Mysterious Assassin. In fact, the altar of Chezrith is a commonly built structure across Kalda for a certain faction of Chezrith's followers. As with the other stories in this collection, we wanted to showcase a local that was not seen in any of our prior publications. The city-nation of Kildath had been mentioned by name several times, with a brief second-hand account of its citizens' day-to-day lives from an innkeeper during the mage's agenda. From that account, Kildath is portrayed as the busiest city of Kalda, a place that would drive a man to seek solitude in the most remote parts of the world. Of all the short stories in the Untold Tales of Kalda collection, Conspiracy in Kildath grabs the reader by the throat and hurls them deep into a world filled with strange new things. We strongly suggest using the glossary as you read along, as Zanxsthy'll does not give many descriptions. He expects you to keep pace with his lightning speed. Dan Zangari and Robert Zangari. Salt Lake City, 2020. Conspiracy in Kildath. 6381 CD. City-nation of Kildath, Gegarin District. The main street of the Gegarin District was crowded beyond anything Zanxsthy'll had ever seen. Children hurriedly pushed their way through the street, weaving around handcarts and horse-drawn carriages. Merchants shouted deals on their wares, their voices barely carrying over the noisy traffic. All the while, men and women steadily moved along either side of the street like a flowing river. Though he had expected a hustle and bustle, this was mind-boggling. The city of Zanxsthy'll was never this crowded. Zanxsthy'll shook his head in disbelief, dodging several children who cut in front of him. He could see why this city was chosen as their final testing ground. Zanxsthy'll had only to prove his abilities in the human realm before being acknowledged as Zanxsthy'll, the order of his kind that secretly walked among men. A pack of children ran past Zanxsthy'll, forcing him to stop abruptly. A mirthful chuckle left the lips of Zanxsthy'll's grandfather, who was walking beside him. Old Zanxsthy'll had an amused expression upon his bearded face. Those white hairs hid many of his wrinkles, but they did nothing to conceal the smile lines around his brown eyes. White hair stood on end atop his head, neatly cropped around his larger-than-average ears. Zanxsthy'll's smile spread his full lips across his face and flared the nostrils of his round nose. Many people thought Zanxsthy'll resembled his grandfather, though Zanxsthy'll's hair and beard were a dark brown, almost black. After all, Zanxsthy'll was barely old enough to be considered an adult. Both he and his grandfather were of average height and had similar firm physiques, not brawny, but still strong, even Zanxsthy'll in his old age. "Oh, I've missed Kildath," Zanxsthy'll said, his deep voice another trait he shared with Zanxsthy'll. Raising an eyebrow at old Zanxsthy'll wondered, how could one miss this? The street was practically chaotic. "Don't worry," Zanxsthy'll said reassuringly. "You'll get used to it after a few decades. I often find our homeland sparse and lonely." He was careful not to mention the name Zanxsthy'll. "I hear some don't get used to it," Zanxsthy'll said warily. Zanxsthy'll gracefully dodged a pack of children before replying. Those tend to lack empathy. And that is something you have in no short supply. Zanxsthy'll pondered his grandfather's words as they pressed through the throng. From his earliest memory, his grandfather had talked about empathy. One could not be a proper Yuuzhan without it. Zanxsthy'll often preached that no matter how skilled you were, if you lacked empathy you weren't suited to live among men. Take the next left, Zanxsthy'll said, Kadden's shop will be on the right. Though the next street wasn't as packed, it was still too crowded for Zanxsthy'll. They'd passed several buildings when his grandfather motioned for Zanxsthy'll to stop. Old Zanxsthy'll pointed to a narrow 4-story building, the floor-to-ceiling windows on its lower floor displaying fanciful clothing. A sign hung on a post near a glass door, reading in gilded script, Kaddan Salarim, the finest couturier in Kildath. A little ostentatious, Zanxsthy'll thought, but he knew many Yuuzhan took upon themselves pretentious guises. I will not be like that, he vowed, then followed his grandfather to the shop's door. Bells announced their entrance, ringing in various parts of the shop, and Zanxsthy'll thought he heard a faint ringing on the upper floors as well. Display cases filled much of the shop, each with mannequins wearing elaborate clothing for both men and women. Before the bells ceased ringing, a woman in a taut dress rounded the nearest display cases. Her face was made up to near excessiveness. Do you have an appointment? She asked, studying the two men, undoubtedly judging their clothes. Neither wore anything as luxurious as what was displayed in the cases. In a manner of speaking, Zanxsthy'll said with a nod. Kaddan is expecting us. I'm afraid Mr. Salarim is occupied for the afternoon, the woman said in a supercilious tone. But I can take a message for him. A message won't be necessary, Zanxsthy'll said, clasping his hands behind his back. He assumed a pose that looked regal. Please tell him Lith is here, as per our arrangement. The woman scoffed at the name, pursing her lips disapprovingly. She studied Zanxsthy'll once again, obviously unimpressed by his clothing, and then shook her head. The name Lith was rarely used in the human realm, or so Zanxsthy'll had been taught. Lith Luzdam had freed the world from the tyranny of the Carthar Empire 1,000 years ago, and some reverenced the name for the act while some hated it. Zanxsthy'll assumed this woman was one of the latter. You'll have to excuse me, Your Majesty, she said mockingly, but I have actual customers to attend to. Good day. With that, she spun and wove through the display cases, disappearing from sight. She soon engaged unseen customers, speaking in a stuffy manner. And his last assistant was so accommodating, Zanxsthy'll muttered, then strode farther into the shop, his footsteps silent. Come on, let's go find him. Zanxsthy'll remained at the door for a moment, then followed his grandfather with no less stealth. As with all Yuuzhan, he had been trained to move silently since childhood. Weaving around display cases, they made their way to the back of the shop and snuck into a hallway. The woman's conversation with the customers faded as a staircase came into view. Zanxsthy'll crept up the steps, ascending without a sound. Cautious, Zanxsthy'll glanced back to the room with the display cases before easing onto the stairs. He gently put more weight on the step, checking for potential creaking. He glimpsed his grandfather ascending in a zigzag pattern. Zanxsthy'll took note of where old Zanxsthy'll stepped and followed his grandfather with exact precision. Once on the second floor, Zanxsthy'll looked about, then pointed a finger to the ceiling. Kaddan was undoubtedly on one of the upper floors. They climbed another staircase a moment later, no less stealthily than the first. Now on the third floor, Zanxsthy'll gestured down a hall. As they continued sneaking past several closed doors, Zanxsthy'll's eyes lingered on a string rising from the floor. The string, rigged to the wall and ceiling by small pulleys, ran across the ceiling to a bell hanging above a door squarely positioned at the end of the hall. So I was right, Zanxsthy'll thought, recalling the faint ringing he'd heard when first entering the shop. Kaddan's apartment is there, Zanxsthy'll whispered, pointing to the door. Zanxsthy'll nodded and watched as his grandfather knocked in a pattern. It was the opening beat of a song written over 1,000 years ago, before the tyrannical reign of the Carther Empire. The ancient melody was taught to each of the Yuzas and Shas before leaving Zanxsthy'll. Old Zanxsthy'll said the song had become lost to time, thus making it the perfect means for the Yuzas and Shah to announce themselves to each other. After finishing the knock, Zanxsthy'll drew his lips to a line. Silence hung over the hall as they awaited Kadden's arrival. A moment later, Zanxsthy'll knocked again, but there was still no reply. Zanxsthy'll tried the knob, but the door was locked. "Why don't you work on this?" he said, gesturing to the lock. "I'll be right back." With that, old Zanxsthy'll snuck through one of the nearby doors, a storage room, from what Zanxsthy'll gleaned from a glance. "All right." Zanxsthy'll narrowed his eyes and leaned to the knob. It was a simple lock. Nothing he couldn't handle. Several ideas came to him: he could pick it, or transmute a key, or unlock the mechanism with kinetic manipulation. All three would produce the same result, and each would make the same amount of noise. For a brief moment he weighed each action, then glanced inside the keyhole. It was dark. Odd. Most keyholes in the human realm were said to be lockable from both sides, a simple mechanism. This one was probably more complex. Manipulation it is, he decided, then whispered an incantation in the true magical tongue. Zanxsthy'll gripped the knob and nearly hugged the door, his belly pressed against his hand, as white light flowed from his palm. His body partially concealed the light, a habit he had been taught to embrace when using magic while out in the world. The use of magic was not forbidden, at least in most parts of Kalda. But the guises a Yuzas and Shah embraced often precluded proficiency in the magical arts. As the magic flowed into the lock, Zanxsthy'll felt the various parts. He closed his eyes and could see the pins of the tumbler in his mind. Through his thoughts he pressed ever so slightly with his magic, careful not to make too much noise. After a moment, he found the correct amount of pressure needed to push the pins past the lock's shear line. While maintaining the pressure through his kinetic manipulation, Zanxsthy'll turned the knob. He held a hand to the door, pushing on it while pulling back on the knob, opening it partway with complete silence. Zanxsthy'll, however, did not enter the apartment. A sunlit sitting room lay beyond the door. Thin shears covered the windows, and thick draperies were drawn and tied against the walls. A couch and a pair of chairs, each upholstered in a subdued blue fabric, were neatly arranged in front of a fireplace. The room was connected to an adjoining dining area filled with a glossy dark brownish-red table and matching chairs. Zanxsthy'll strained to hear inside, but all was silent. Perhaps he's not here, Zanxsthy'll thought, then glanced over his shoulder. His grandfather emerged from the farthest door, nonchalantly striding back down the hall. "Well?" Zanxsthy'll whispered. Zanxsthy'll shook his head, then opened the door farther. He stepped aside, allowing his grandfather an opportunity to inspect the sitting room. Old Zanxsthy'll raised an eyebrow and pursed his lips before striding through the door. He moved to the center of the sitting room and looked about, careless of the windows. Odd, Zanxsthy'll thought, still in the hall. Why hadn't his grandfather concealed himself before entering the sitting room? All Yuzas and Shahs had been taught to conceal themselves when entering a place they shouldn't. "Come on in," Zanxsthy'll said, moving to an end table near the windows. "And lock the door." Still confused, Zanxsthy'll obeyed. As he shut the door, slow deliberate applause came from the dining room. "Well done," said a sly mid-ranged voice between claps. Zanxsthy'll spun. Beside the dining table, a short balding man appeared from a veil of invisibility. He wore fanciful clothes like that displayed in the shop. Was all that sneaking about part of the test? Zanxsthy'll wondered. "That was good," the man said, "I didn't even hear the door unlock." Zanxsthy'll narrowed his eyes, glancing to his grandfather then back to the bald man, who was now chuckling. That would explain grandfather's casual regard, he thought, noticing the bald man approaching with his hand extended. "Well, I wouldn't expect anything less," Zanxsthy'll said, smiling. And Chrysilla downstairs did quite well this time. It was a test, Zanxsthy'll thought, half listening to his grandfather recount their experience in the shop with Cadden's assistant. The bald man nodded with a chuckle, stopping an arm's length away. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Zanxsthy'll. I am Ulvina Minar, currently going by the name of Cadden Salarim. You may call me by either name as long as we are alone. I know some potentials prefer calling our kind by our true names." Cadden, or rather Ulvina Minar, grinned as he waited for Zanxsthy'll to return the greeting gesture. "Likewise," Zanxsthy'll said reluctantly, shaking the bald man's hand. Ulvina Minar nodded, then moved toward Zanxsthy'll. The two of them embraced in a brotherly hug. "It is good to see you again," old Zanxsthy'll said, grinning fondly at Ulvina Minar. "Now what kind of test do you have for my grandson?" "Oh, it is a good one." Ulvina Minar grinned, turning to face Zanxsthy'll. "Normally the task is something I would handle, but I think one of your lineage is up for the challenge." He paused, then glanced back to Zanxsthy'll. "Over the last 2 years I've been watching a particular gang of thugs, the Veiled Scars. Odd name, I know. Anyway, their numbers have grown considerably the last few months, and there is a chance they are smuggling Tef Israels. One of my informants, a girl named Kydania, spotted several of the scars with objects that were glowing. She followed them to a tavern called the Trident's Wellspring, where she believes they dropped off the objects." He paused and studied Zanxsthy'll and Zanxsthy'll. While at the tavern, Kydania overheard one of the scars talking in code to a man about a peculiar shipment arriving later today. "My proposed task for you, Zanxsthy'll, is to infiltrate the Veiled Scars, discover the contents of this shipment, locate their hidden cache, and inventory all the objects the Veiled Scars have smuggled." Ulvina Minar turned to Zanxsthy'll, undoubtedly seeking his approval. "I think that's reasonable," Zanxsthy'll said with a nod. "Good. I told Kydania she would be meeting with another of my informants, a man named Zanxsthy'll." Intrigued, Zanxsthy'll nodded in agreement. He liked that name. As an Yuzazinsha he would be required to take upon him many names. "Perhaps I'll include that one," he mused. Over the last couple of years he had made a list of names he considered using, Zatrin, Zatail, Khazar, and Kandish, to name a few. He had decided upon several dozen, more than enough to last a lifetime. "She will be expecting you soon," Ulvina Minar said, glancing to a clock atop the fireplace's mantel. "Now look into my eyes so we can meld. That will save us some time." With that, Ulvina Minar's green eyes shifted. His irises swirled around his pupils, reverting to their natural state. Their gazes locked and Zanxsthy'll felt himself become still. He had experienced a melding only once before, and the incident had been rather disturbing, despite his asking for it. Zanxsthy'll had wanted to know his mother, so old Zanxsthy'll had melded with him so Zanxsthy'll could see her through his eyes. Now, as Ulvina Minar performed the meld, images flashed in Zanxsthy'll's mind, accompanied by emotions and insight. He saw a young woman with shoulder-length golden hair who he knew was Kydania. A sense of paternal protection accompanied the memory of Kydania, a sensation he had recognized when old Zanxsthy'll showed Zanxsthy'll his mother. More images flashed in Zanxsthy'll's mind, of Kydania's report and the Veiled Scars. He knew each detail, including the description of the brutish man the thugs had reported to, Vrais. Vrais was distinguished by a crescent-shaped scar on his right cheek, curving from the edge of his eye toward his mouth and ending below his chin. Amid the images of the report, Ulvina Minar turned away, severing his connection to Zanxsthy'll's mind. Zanxsthy'll blinked, taking in a deep breath. "Remember," Ulvina Minar grabbed Zanxsthy'll's arm, "we are to watch and observe, nothing more. If they are indeed smuggling Tef Israels, I will send a message to those who will deal with it." Zanxsthy'll nodded quickly. "I suggest using the roof access," Ulvina Minar said, sauntering toward the nearest chair. "You can get there through the attic. Just go up the stairs beyond the dining room and open the hatch in the hallway." Old Zanxsthy'll chuckled softly. "Have fun, Zanxsthy'll. And good luck. Thank you, grandfather. Zanxsthy'll nodded before striding from the sitting room. Zanxsthy'll concealed himself in a veil of invisibility before reaching the roof of Ulvinaminar's shop. The roof access was actually a broken dormer window with loose shutters that swayed with the wind. He thought it rather unsecure, especially for an Yuzazin Shah. Once upon the roof, Zanxsthy'll surveyed the Gegarin District. Many of the surrounding buildings were just as tall as Ulvinaminar's shop. He glanced to the east. From the melding, he'd gleaned that Kydania lived in one of many apartment homes several blocks away from the district's main street. Zanxsthy'll glanced at the street below, noting the traffic. He returned his gaze to the rooftops, and a smile came over his invisible face. There was a better way to reach Kydania, and it did not involve evading playful children. He whispered the words of an enhancing incantation in the true magical tongue. In an instant, enhancing particles, concealed by the veil of invisibility, surged through Zanxsthy'll. His muscles swelled with newfound vigor. But the enhancement was not enough. He could now leap the distance between the buildings, but he would make noise when he landed. He uttered another incantation in the true magical tongue, mustering an inverted barrier of Bar-Zion magic. The protecting particles, concealed like those of the enhancing spell, swirled around Zanxsthy'll, creating a barrier along his hands, feet, and chest. Normally, Bar-Zion barriers would act like impenetrable armor, but this variant would protect whatever surface he came in contact with. This barrier would negate any force, both physical and magical in nature. Satisfied, Zanxsthy'll dashed across the rooftop, leaping the distance between Ulvinaminar's shop and the neighboring building. He soared through the air, landing without as much as a grunt. Elated, he bounded toward the next building, leaping unnaturally once again. Zanxsthy'll crossed the Gegarin District in a fraction of the time it would have taken him to navigate the streets. He skidded to a halt upon nearing Kydania's apartment building. I could leap the distance, he glanced to the street, but I would be cutting it close. The street below was wide enough for 4 carriages to pass side by side, not to mention the walks for pedestrians along the street. Perhaps I shouldn't chance it, Zanxsthy'll thought warily. It was a considerable jump, despite the enhancing magic. He made his way to the ground and crossed the street, still invisible. I need to find a spot to appear, he mused, glancing about the street. This street wasn't as crowded as the others he had traversed with his grandfather. But it was still busy. He settled his gaze on a narrow alleyway alongside the building next to Kydania's apartment. It was devoid of traffic, with barrels and crates stacked along the buildings. There. Zanxsthy'll hurried toward the alley, dodging a jogging man and a pack of dashing children, all yelling. He hadn't imagined encountering so many cheerful children. The young of Zanxsthy'll never played in the streets. The commotion of the Gegarin District faded as Zanxsthy'll pressed his way into the narrow alleyway, weaving around stacks of crates and barrels. Perfect, he mused, stopping between several stacks. He couldn't see the street from which he'd come, or whatever lay beyond the alley's other exit. Zanxsthy'll immediately dismissed his concealing veil. As he turned back to the street, the noises of a scuffle echoed into the alley from behind the buildings. Zanxsthy'll spun to the noise, a wave of tension coming over him. Wary, he pressed farther into the alley, concealing himself behind crates and barrels as he moved. Muffled shouts carried into the alley, sounding as if they came from beneath a gag. The scuffle grew louder as Zanxsthy'll rounded the last crate. The rest of the alleyway, the length of a horse-drawn carriage, was empty and intersected another alley between more buildings. The struggling sounds came from the right, now accompanied by a faint conversation. "Don't care, just get her in." The words came from a growling man. That sounds nefarious, Zanxsthy'll thought, hurrying to the intersection. He immediately regretted dismissing his concealing veil and looked over his shoulder. No one was around, and he sucked in his breath, quickly coming to a rash decision. "Siam," he whispered, again mustering his concealing veil. The simple word was the only incantation needed to recast his invisibility. More muffled sounds filled the alley as Zanxsthy'll rounded the corner. Four burly men in dark brown clothing, long-sleeve shirts, vests, and trousers, carried a thrashing woman by her limbs toward a windowless black carriage. The woman was gagged, and her golden hair whipped about, concealing her face as she struggled. "I said get her in there," barked a man near the carriage, angrily gesturing toward the open door. "You should hit her over the head," said one of the men carrying the woman, his comment directed to the one near the carriage. "Jorgen's blow would probably kill her," another said with a laugh. The man gesturing to the door, Jorgen, Zanxsthy'll assumed, did not look amused. "I said hurry," he spat. "We've already roughed her up enough. Besides, Vraz wants her in one piece." Zanxsthy'll cocked his head upon hearing the name. Were these men members of the Veiled Scars? He studied each of them, memorizing their features. Then Zanxsthy'll took a better look at the woman. Though her face was bruised and swollen, he recognized her. Kydania. "Great." Zanxsthy'll grumbled, "Just great." The men shoved her into the carriage, and Jorgen slammed the door, locking it from the outside. Faint pounding and muffled cries sounded from the carriage as the men climbed atop it. Jorgen took the driver's seat while the others sat on a bench along the back or atop the roof, their legs dangling over the sides. Zanxsthy'll neared the carriage just as it pulled away. A fury welled within him, a fiery anger unlike anything he had ever experienced. He could not let them escape. Whatever these men were planning to do to Kydania, Zanxsthy'll could not allow it. Still enhanced by his magics, Zanxsthy'll dashed toward one of the nearby buildings and leapt unnaturally to a third-story balcony. Zanxsthy'll flew to a rooftop. He cleared the eave and landed soundlessly. He kept an eye on the black carriage while dashing from building to building. Despite his hasty pursuit, Zanxsthy'll remained undetected. His inverted bar's ion dampened each landing, protecting the various rooftops. The carriage pushed through traffic, dangerously weaving around other carriages and carts. The drivers of the other vehicles, and the nearby pedestrians, warily avoided the black carriage, undoubtedly knowing to whom it belonged. For a moment, Zanxsthy'll bounded ahead of the carriage. He took in his surroundings, recognizing this part of the Gegarin District through memories not his own. The Trident's wellspring lay one street to the south and nearly 3 blocks to the east, on Verdun Way. While leaping to another building, Zanxsthy'll glanced back to the carriage. They must be going to the Trident's wellspring, he thought, then recalled an alleyway behind the tavern, though the memory was not his. Zanxsthy'll skidded to a halt as he neared an intersection, barely stopping at the rooftop's edge. A scowl formed upon his face as he watched the carriage turn south. Before resuming his pursuit, Zanxsthy'll looked in the direction of the Trident's wellspring. He couldn't see the tavern, but he knew where it was located. Still on the eve, he glimpsed the carriage continuing south beyond Verdun Way. Hauling a kicking and screaming woman from a carriage would undoubtedly attract attention. They must be going to the alley. Before continuing his pursuit, Zanxsthy'll glanced at the street. Verdun Way was just as wide, if not wider, than the street outside Kydania's apartment. The nearest building was just as tall as the one he was on. I can make it, he thought. Emboldened with protective zeal, Zanxsthy'll dashed to the south, leaping through the air. He cleared the street, but fell short of the next rooftop. No. He spotted an oversized windowsill on the 3rd floor. As Zanxsthy'll fell, he reached for the sill, narrowly grabbing it. He slammed against the wall, but the inverted bar's ion stopped him from crashing through it. Zanxsthy'll hung for a moment, glancing to the street and then to the rooftop. There was another window above and to his right, but nothing directly above him. The eave was more than 2 stories away. There's no way I can throw myself up there, he thought, quickly running through potential solutions. He didn't want to drop to the street, as there were too many people below him. I'll have to weave an ensnaring cord, he decided, whispering an incantation. He held onto the sill with one hand while extending the other. As with the other magics, the arcane spell coalesced beneath his veil of invisibility. Fibers of magic wove together around his free hand, forming a cord that could stretch well beyond its original length and attach to most surfaces. Once the cord formed, Zanxsthy'll threw it toward the rooftop. It attached to the roof tiles, and at his mental command he shrank the cord, pulling himself up. Zanxsthy'll was on the roof within seconds and resumed his dash to the south. Amid his bounding, the black carriage traveled down another alleyway leading to the tavern's back entrance. Determined, Zanxsthy'll leapt through the air, unconcerned where he would land. As he fell he threw the cord toward a building hemming the alley. It attached to a wall below the eave and Zanxsthy'll swung through the alleyway like a pendulum. The momentum of his swing carried him above the rooftops, and Zanxsthy'll threw himself sideways, spinning in the air. He fell twirling toward a rooftop not too far from the trident's wellspring. Landing, Zanxsthy'll relinquished his ensnaring cord's adhesion. Not waiting for the cord to slither back to him, Zanxsthy'll dashed across the rooftops toward the trident's wellspring. The carriage came to a halt as Zanxsthy'll reached the tavern. Unlike its neighbors, the trident's wellspring only rose 3 stories. The thugs pushed off from their perches atop the carriage as Gegarin shouted orders to them, fiddling with his key as 2 of the men hurried inside the tavern. Zanxsthy'll fought the urge to swoop down and rescue Kydania. "You are not supposed to interfere," he told himself, watching the thugs with narrowed eyes. At least not in a direct manner. Acting now would only draw unwanted attention. If the men were all in one room, without any outside observers, he could justify dealing with them. Soon, the thugs who had entered the tavern returned with ropes. Gegarin opened the carriage door, and Kydania leapt through the opening, free of her gag. The thugs, however, caught her before she landed. She struggled against them, shouting pleas for help. Her cries ignited more anger within Zanxsthy'll. "You don't even know this woman," he told himself. But in a way he did, through Ulvina Minar's memories. The thugs bound Kydania and gagged her once again. Gegarin growled a command, leading the thugs into the tavern's rear entrance. As the last thug neared the doors, Zanxsthy'll lashed his ensnaring cord to the rooftop, then jumped. He fell toward the alley, but slowed his descent with the cord, stopping just short of crashing into the ground, not that it would have mattered. His inverted bar Zion was still active. The tavern's door began to swing shut, but Zanxsthy'll swiftly snuck inside, coiling his ensnaring cord around his arm. He shadowed the thugs, following them through weaving corridors. The Trident's wellspring wasn't the most luxurious establishment, if the back halls were anything to judge by. As they moved, Kydania attempted more cries for help through her gag, but her pleas couldn't have reached beyond the halls. After several turns, Gegarin stopped at an open doorway leading to a storeroom. "Come on," Gegarin said with a jerk of his head, "get her in there." The thugs filed inside, as did Zanxsthy'll. He narrowly evaded Gegarin as he entered the storeroom. Gegarin soon closed the door, and one of the thugs turned to a thick jar along the far wall, twisting it. Part of the wall opened outward, revealing a polished stone room unlike the storeroom. "What's this?" Zanxsthy'll wondered, watching the thugs file into the new room. He quickly regained his composure and followed them, stealthily weaving around the men holding Kydania. "Get her to Vraz," Gegarin snarled, then twisted the thick jar. The wall moved back into place, then white light surged from the floor and ceiling, turning the fake wall into solid stone. "Interesting," Zanxsthy'll mused. "That jar must be connected to some kind of tefizral." The thugs took the still thrashing Kydania through a narrow corridor, and Zanxsthy'll followed them toward an opening in the floor. When he reached it, he saw a tight circular staircase extending downward and illuminated by brilliantly glowing gemstones inlaid in the stairwell's walls. As they descended the stairs, Zanxsthy'll struggled with the decision of when to free Kydania. "If I can reach Vraz, I can accomplish my task," he told himself. "Through him I can discover what the veiled scars are doing." I just hope Kydania doesn't suffer from my inaction. The staircase descended several floors, emptying into a roughly hewn chamber, much like a natural tunnel. Odd, he thought. During his studies to become Uzazensha, Zanxsthy'll had learned that many of the ancient cities in the human realm had infrastructure that ran deep below ground. Kildath was no exception. But most, if not all, of those underground parts were long forgotten to the men of Kalda. When first entering the stone chamber, he thought it might be a remnant of the past. But after seeing this tunnel, he had reconsidered the notion. Perhaps this part of Kildath is newer, he mused, constructed within the last few hundred years. But that assumption couldn't explain away the stone chamber. That room, and the stairwell, were not of modern construction, especially with integrated tefisrals. Such practices had been lost among men centuries ago. Kydania's muffled shouts echoed off the tunnel walls, but the echoing soon ceased. Her cries sounded distant. Zanxsthy'll quickened his pace, rounding a bend where the natural tunnel emptied onto a rocky ledge. It overlooked a cavern that could have accommodated 3 or 4 city blocks, with a ceiling almost as tall as the buildings in the Gegarin District. He stopped at the tunnel's mouth, surveying the vast space. Large sapphire shards extended downward from the ceiling, glistening with unnatural light. The ledge upon which he stood was 3 stories above a shallow pool of water. The ledge continued along the sides of the cavern, sloping toward the far end of the pool. A semicircular amphitheater of roughly hewn stone stood at the far end of the cavern, off-center from the ledge. Every seat faced an altar positioned beneath a tall statue with wings and 3 serpentine heads. These aren't mere thugs. Zanxsthy'll growled to himself, focusing on the statue and the altar. Scaled fingers tipped with talons held up the altar. Glowing crimson symbols marked the altar's sides. Though he couldn't read the symbols clearly, Zanxsthy'll knew they were not part of any language known among men. His gaze shifted to the accursed statue. Though he had never seen one like it, Zanxsthy'll knew the statue represented the ancient enemy of his ancestors, a being erroneously deified by many of Kalda's long-dead inhabitants. The statue was more symbolic than realistic, despite the accuracy of many of its features, as no Shah Kalda had 3 heads. Regaining his composure, Zanxsthy'll hurried after the thugs carrying Kydania. As they neared the amphitheater, Zanxsthy'll glimpsed movement from a tunnel behind the statue. 3 men exited the tunnel, striding toward the altar. Each was tall and muscular, the kind of men who often guarded taverns and gambling dens, or so Zanxsthy'll had heard. He had never been to a tavern prior to entering the Trident's wellspring. Zanxsthy'll studied the newcomers, settling his gaze on the man in the center. The crescent scar on his face was unmistakable. Vrais. Vrais looked exactly like the depiction Zanxsthy'll recalled from Ulvina Minar's memories. His face was flat and his nose small. Wide, flat lips were downturned in a grimace. Sleek black hair was combed back, and his pale gray eyes glared at Kydania with brutal ferocity. "Where is Jorgen?" Vrais demanded, furrowing his brow in displeasure. His voice boomed throughout the cavern. "He went to check on the others, Vrais," one of the men said. "We left 6 to deal with another man she was supposed to meet." He gestured to Kydania. "So they were after me too, huh?" Zanxsthy'll crept closer to the amphitheater. What a test! Had any of the other Uzazensha undergone such a challenge? Kydania continued to struggle as the thugs carried her to the altar. 2 of her captors pinned her atop the altar while another secured her with more rope. "This can go one of 2 ways," Vrais said, pacing around the men binding Kydania. "Either way, you will tell us what we want to know." He gestured to one of his brawny escorts. "Remove her gag." Zanxsthy'll reached the floor of the amphitheater as the men stepped away from Kydania. Her gag came loose, and she resumed shouting for help. "No one can hear you." Vrais laughed menacingly. "Did you not see where they were taking you? You are well below ground, your pleas far beyond the reach of anyone who can help you." I would argue against that, Zanxsthy'll thought, smirking. He fought the urge to appear from his veil of invisibility. Just a little longer. Vraz paced along the altar once again before speaking. My men told me you've been spying on them. You are obviously not part of the city watch. And you are not documented as one of their informants. A sinister grin formed upon Vraz's face, one he undoubtedly hoped would elicit a reaction from Kydania. The woman, however, remained defiant. A strong girl, Zanxsthy'll thought, recalling her through his melded memory as a tough street urchin. Those are not your memories, he told himself, unnerved. Do you take me for a fool? Kydania spat. The grin faded from Vraz's face and he pursed his lips, restraining his apparent anger. Who are you working for? He demanded, balling his fist. With an effort, he relaxed his posture. Kydania grunted. I will break you, Vraz vowed, his tone flat. You confessed to my men about your associate, so you are not as impervious as you're implying. No, she is, Zanxsthy'll recalled. He knew she wouldn't break under pressure. Ulvina Minar had enlisted Kydania because of her indomitable will. Nothing short of a mind-controlling spell could pry her mind open. Let's hope it doesn't come to that, Zanxsthy'll thought. None of these men looked like they were adept in the magical arts. But then again, they were in this cavern with that statue. Who is this man you were to meet? Vraz asked, pacing once again. I don't know, Kydania said. I never met him. And who arranged this meeting? Vraz demanded. Someone who will topple you and your vile syndicate, Kydania said, grinning. You insolent Visak. Vraz shouted, striking Kydania across her cheek. What? Zanxsthy'll started. He glanced to the three-headed statue, then back to Vraz. This Vraz was no ordinary man, especially if he knew that particular curse. If he's a man at all. Vraz stepped away, balling and relaxing his fists over and over. Vraz, a thug cleared his throat, why don't we try another method? Vraz turned to the man, glowering. I mean, I'm not questioning your methods, the man stammered. Pain is a good motivator, but why not let us have fun with her for a bit? Kydania flinched but regained her stony composure. She appeared to be bracing for something awful. Strip her, Vraz gestured, waving his hand in a dismissal. He walked away from the altar as the thugs crowded around Kydania with lustful cries. No. This was going too far. Zanxsthy'll could not stand by and allow such an atrocious act. Are we really confined to only watch and observe? Perhaps he was not suited to be Yuzazinsha. Not if he had to stand by and watch such suffering. A scream accompanied tearing fabric as Zanxsthy'll dashed toward the altar, appearing from his veil of invisibility. Stop, he bellowed, drawing the attention of all in the cavern. Vraz spun, as did his burly escorts. So, is this the man you were to meet? He demanded of Kydania. An Elathian agent, perhaps? Zanxsthy'll unraveled his ensnaring cord before reaching the nearest thug and dismissed his inverted bar Zion. That particular bar Zion would be counterproductive in a fight. In one swift motion, Zanxsthy'll swung the hand holding the cord across his chest. The cord lashed against the thug and tugged him to the ground with a resounding thud. Not a second later, Zanxsthy'll commanded the cord to relinquish its grip, then twirled it once above his head before striking the next thug. He swung the cord, pulling the thug face first to the cavern floor. The other two thugs rounded the altar, advancing on Zanxsthy'll as their comrades groaned from the assault. Relinquishing his cord's grip once again, Zanxsthy'll threw his arm back, then across his chest. The cord followed the same motion, lashing onto one of the thugs and pulling him into the other man. The thugs collided, joining the others on the ground. Impressive, Vraz said in mock praise, his escorts running to intercept Zanxsthy'll. Zanxsthy'll spun to meet the burly men. His cord slithered back to him, weaving around the fallen thugs. I can fight them or probe them, he thought, eyeing his advancing foes. A tussle seemed like fun, but the latter would prove more productive. He had never performed a probing, though he knew how to do it. Zanxsthy'll allowed his eyes to regress to their natural state, much as Ulvinaminar had done. He focused on the man to his left, gazing directly into the man's eyes. The burly fellow froze amid his dash, and his mind became open to Zanxsthy'll. The man, named Fitur, became pliable under Zanxsthy'll's probing. He searched Fitur's thoughts, reliving memories in an instant. Amid his probing, the other man, who Zanxsthy'll had learned was named Gegarin, came within arm's reach. Gegarin swung at Zanxsthy'll. Still holding his gaze on Fitur, Zanxsthy'll evaded the blow, then followed up with a flurry of punches. Gegarin managed to block or parry most, but Zanxsthy'll landed a blow to the man's chest that sent him flying. "You," Vraz growled. "You are no Alathian." His words were filled with rage, and his face was a perfect reflection of his tone. "You vile platinum beast." Platinum beast. This Vraz was definitely no ordinary man. In that instant, Zanxsthy'll finished probing Fitur's mind, discovering that the objects seen by Kydania were indeed Tefisrals. Vraz had gathered them here in this grotto, a place he had named the Altar of Chezareth. Through his peripheral vision, Zanxsthy'll glimpsed Gegarin recovering from the blow and the other thugs pushing themselves up from the ground. "Sleep," he commanded Fitur. The man collapsed, completely subject to Zanxsthy'll's probing gaze. Zanxsthy'll turned to face Gegarin, a burning fury swelling within him. He had seen the crimes committed by Vraz and his thugs, crimes that were no less brutal than what they intended for Kydania. Zanxsthy'll could not let them go unpunished. Vigilantism is a dangerous path. Old Zuthil's voice echoed in his mind. Gegarin advanced and Zanxsthy'll eased into a battle stance. They clashed, exchanging blow after blow. Amid the melee Ulvinaminar's warning came to Zanxsthy'll, "Remember, we are to watch and observe, nothing more." Zanxsthy'll dodged a blow. Too late for that, he thought, taking a fist to his chest. Before Gegarin could pull back, Zanxsthy'll grappled the man's wrist. He thrust Gegarin's hand down and to the side, causing the man's stance to falter. As Gegarin staggered, Zanxsthy'll lunged, kicking the man's knee. A resounding crack accompanied a pained scream as Gegarin fell to the ground. "That's two," Zanxsthy'll told himself, glancing to the thugs. Each was pale, their mouths gaping and their eyes bulging. Zanxsthy'll's gaze, however, was drawn to Vraz. Fire encircled the man, nearly covering him, undoubtedly some kind of fiery bar-zion. A flaming shaft formed in Vraz's right hand, the length of a long sword. I didn't hear any incantations, Zanxsthy'll thought in dismay. Perhaps Vraz had obtained a Tefisral that would enable the manifestation of elemental magics. Fitur didn't know what many of the Tefisrals were capable of doing, only that they were Tefisrals. "You," the word oozed contemptuously from Vraz's mouth. "You and your kind are always meddling in our affairs." The flaming shaft compressed, becoming a thin blade. Fire danced about the magically composed weapon, persisting like an ever-present aura. "Well, this cord isn't going to stand up to that," Zanxsthy'll thought. He glanced to the thugs. They were even more astonished at the mystical display around Vraz than they were at Zanxsthy'll's swift dispatch of Fitur and Gegarin. Although the thugs weren't taking any action, Zanxsthy'll couldn't just let them be. They had to be subdued. He uttered an incantation, swiftly mustering enthralling magic. 5 glistening white orbs formed around his hands, and he flung 4 of them at the thugs. One, however, remained hovering near him. One of the thugs started upon seeing the magic and attempted to dodge, but the enthralling orb struck him, and he fell to the cavern floor. The others simply froze where they stood. Seeing that the thugs were subdued, Vraz ran toward Zanxsthy'll, screaming a battle cry. He raised his flaming sword, ready to strike. Zanxsthy'll attempted to probe Vry's, but the man had averted his gaze. Vry's eyes were unfocused, looking in Zanxsthy'll's general direction, but not at him. He knows what my eyes can do, Zanxsthy'll thought, bemused. Vry's closed the gap, swinging his sword. Zanxsthy'll threw himself sideways, evading the blow, and swiftly rolled back onto his feet. As Vry's rebounded, Zanxsthy'll uttered an incantation in the true magical tongue. Sutak vermisare. Vibrant violet light burst from his hand. Zanxsthy'll raised his hand as Vry's swung at him. The violet light instantly formed a sharp shaft, narrowly blocking Vry's blow. This weapon was much like the one wielded by Vry's, except this blade was composed of condensed disintegrating particles. Wisps of consuming particles persisted around Zanxsthy'll's blade, consuming the flame spurting from Vry's weapon. Both weapons crackled as their wielders recoiled from the clash. Zanxsthy'll swung his blade toward Vry's waist, but the man parried the blow. Vry struck again. Zanxsthy'll blocked, attempting to lock a probing gaze with Vry's. The man, however, kept his eyes averted. Great! Zanxsthy'll grumbled to himself. If he couldn't subdue Vry's with his eyes, he would have to resort to other methods. Vry's would be immune to enthralling magic as long as his fiery bar Zion was active. If Zanxsthy'll wanted to utilize his last enthralling orb, he would have to shatter Vry's bar Zion. The melee intensified. Zanxsthy'll and Vry's both unleashed furious swings at each other, but none landed. They pushed each other back and forth between the altar and the elevated seating area. All the while, Zanxsthy'll attempted to probe Vry's. This is going nowhere. Zanxsthy'll groaned, dodging a sweeping swing. Fire leapt from Vry's blade, singing Zanxsthy'll's hair. Too close. He unleashed his own flurry of blows, feinting a slicing sweep to Vry's head. Zanxsthy'll feinted again, and managed to slice across the fiery bar Zion along Vry's thighs. Vry's growled, lunging. Zanxsthy'll evaded, spinning to face the pool. The pool. He thought, fighting back a grin. Vry's rebounded as Zanxsthy'll uttered another incantation. Telekinetic magic gathered around his free hand. Once the pale gray particles coalesced, Zanxsthy'll thrust his hand at Vry's, unleashing a telekinetic wave. Vry's evaded, lunging toward the altar. Zanxsthy'll, however, changed the direction of his spell, striking Vry's in the back. Surprised, Vry's growled as he was thrown toward the stone benches, then raised into the air. The telekinetic spell forced him toward the ceiling in an arc, and then thrust him into the pool. Steam immediately veiled Vry's from sight. I have you now. Zanxsthy'll grinned. Siam, he whispered, mustering his veil of invisibility. Zanxsthy'll vanished as the cloud of steam violently spread toward the altar. Vry's burst from the steam, but stopped several paces from the pool. He warily searched for Zanxsthy'll. Show yourself, cow. The word abruptly ceased as Vry's sweeping glance unknowingly met Zanxsthy'll's eyes. Vry's froze, his mind pliable under Zanxsthy'll's probing. To Zanxsthy'll's surprise, he discovered that not even Fatur or the others knew the truth about Vry's. He was not human. He was half human and half Kalda, Lish Kalda. A Lish Kisha, Zanxsthy'll thought, appearing from his veil of invisibility. He noticed the flame around Vry's dissipating. Vry's had undoubtedly used the true magical tongue to manifest his bar Zion and weapon, whispering the swift incantations as Zanxsthy'll dealt with Gegarin and the thugs. I should have known, Zanxsthy'll muttered, probing Vry's further. Vry's was not just the leader of a mere band of thugs. His criminal enterprise ran deeper than the veiled scars, with unseen ties to organizations the Yuzazinsha were duty-bound to hunt. Such furtive syndicates, cults, and allegiances fell outside the mandate to watch and observe, for they were not formed by men. A Yuzazinsha could act against such organizations if it seemed necessary. Zanxsthy'll sifted through Vrai's memories, recalling each of the Tefisrals delivered to him. Most were discovered in a dig on the island of Klindala, in one of the mountain ruins. A few others were stolen from wealthy aristocrats from the nation of Maltin. Most of the Tefisrals were simple things. Vrais was collecting the Tefisrals for someone named Angath. He was to have them delivered to her soon, within the month. Vrais had never met Angath, but her reputation as a powerful sorceress was known among the furtive organizations to which he had ties. Zanxsthy'll gleaned more knowledge from Vrais, but did not sever his probing gaze. The fury ignited by reliving Fitur's memories burned more fervently in Zanxsthy'll's heart after he probed Vrais. The man, no, the Keisha, was far from innocent. Vrais deserved death. Zanxsthy'll raised his disintegrating blade toward Vrais' neck, but stopped as a conflict stirred within him. Though he was trained in all the arts of war, Zanxsthy'll had never killed. Zuthil's voice came to Zanxsthy'll's mind, recounting a hard lesson learned from his grandfather's youth. If you kill while fueled with righteous anger, you will come to regret that death as a senseless murder. You might not think it in the moment, but eventually you will. And that regret will stay with you forever. More lessons from his grandfather came to his mind, the memories stilling his blade against Vrais' throat. Conflicted, Zanxsthy'll told himself, but he is the very evil we are to hunt, by the mandate given to the Yuzazin Shah. But Zanxsthy'll was not Yuzazin Shah. Not yet. The test, he thought regretfully. Could he walk away from it? Surely by killing Vrais he would be doing just that. Zanxsthy'll held his blade at Vrais' throat, battling the decision. He weighed his choices, attempting to foresee the course each might take. Well, are you going to kill him or not? Kydania demanded. The question was almost enough to sever his probing. From where he stood, Zanxsthy'll could barely see her. You attacked because of her, Zanxsthy'll thought. He had revealed himself because he couldn't bear to see her suffer. Empathy. The word gave him pause, evoking more lessons from his grandfather. A moment passed, and Zanxsthy'll knew what he must do. Focused on Vrais, Zanxsthy'll gestured his free hand toward the Keisha. The last enthralling orb flew toward Vrais, surging across his body. Your fate is not sealed yet, he whispered. With Vrais enthralled, Zanxsthy'll turned to Kydania. The golden-haired woman struggled with her bonds, attempting to wriggle free. Her blouse was torn from neckline to waist. Another tear marred her pants, from her waist to her thigh. Don't move, Zanxsthy'll said, nearing the altar. Who are you? She demanded, still struggling against her bonds. Zanxsthy'll, he said. Kydania ceased moving, studying Zanxsthy'll intently. Kadin sent me, he said, easing his disintegrating blade toward the ropes around her boots. Be still while I free you. She complied, and he severed her bonds. As Kydania hopped off the altar, she pointed to Gegarin. You missed one, she said. Zanxsthy'll spun, seeing Gegarin pulling himself across the ground, wincing in pain from his shattered knee. The man had nearly reached the ramp leading to the tunnel. It seems I did, he said, then uttered another incantation to muster more enthralling magic. What an odd incantation, Kydania remarked, narrowing her eyes at Zanxsthy'll. Two orbs coalesced, and Zanxsthy'll hurled one at Gegarin. The magic abruptly stilled him mid-motion. I've heard mages cast spells, she continued, and no incantation of theirs was that short. And your eyes, a startled gasp left her lips. Like in that fable, when Saturi's army marched to Nodam's crown and were stilled by the dragon. Great. Zanxsthy'll sighed. Just great. Kydania blinked in disbelief. You, no. She shook her head. You can't be. While she continued muttering near incoherent nonsense, Zanxsthy'll flung the last enthralling orb toward her. The magic stopped her mid-sentence, stilling her like Vrais and his thugs. Well, this complicates things, Zanxsthy'll said. How am I to rectify this? Zanxsthy'll muttered to himself, studying those he had enthralled. Each stood as motionless as a statue. He could rework the memories of Kydania and the thugs, completely erasing the incident while probing their minds. That would ensure that he succeed in his test while also preserving Ulvina Minar's guise. That would work, he thought. But what about Vry's? If Vry's were human, his mind would be just as pliable under Zanxsthy'll's probing. But Vry's was Kisha. He was immune to such an effect, a trait inherited through his Kalda lineage. Perhaps I should deliver you to Ulvina Minar, Zanxsthy'll whispered, glancing to Vry's. I could make each of them remember Vry's telling them he had to leave. That could account for Vry's absence for a time, and if any of his associates came looking for him they would find nothing of his disappearance. Zanxsthy'll nodded, then glanced to Kydania. And what about you? He studied the woman. I will have to repair your clothing. Your capture will also need to be wiped from your mind. Then there was the matter of Jorgen and the rest of the thugs waiting in her apartment. I will have to rework their minds too. Zanxsthy'll frowned and glanced to each of those he had enthralled. Gegarin will need to be healed. He nodded, striding toward the enthralled man. Zanxsthy'll forced him to stand though he was still under the spell. Once near the wounded thug, Zanxsthy'll uttered an incantation to muster Arpran magic. Green light surged from his hand, then shot to Gegarin's knee, mending the shattered bone. The man's leg glowed a green hue, and Zanxsthy'll could feel the wound no more. I suppose I'll start with you first, he said, coercing Gegarin to look into his eyes through the enthralling spell. Their minds melded, and Zanxsthy'll manipulated the man's memories of the day. He also searched for any thought about Kydania and her spying, simply removing the memories. Once finished with Gegarin, Zanxsthy'll moved on to Fitur. One by one he altered the minds of the other thugs. After he was finished, Zanxsthy'll ordered the men to their proper positions. Fitur and Gegarin returned through the tunnel to the chamber where the Tefisrals were kept, while the thugs plodded up the ramp to return to the Trident's wellspring. Time to go, Zanxsthy'll thought, then uttered another incantation, mustering illusionary magic. He clothed himself, Vry's, and Kydania in inconspicuous disguises. Zanxsthy'll had decided against traveling the streets invisibly, since the Gegarin District would be too crowded to navigate successfully. Traveling the rooftops was also out of the question. But, they would still need to escape the Trident's wellspring without being seen. So, he cloaked them in a veil of invisibility. He hurried past the thugs, with the enthralled Kydania and Vry's not far behind him. They reached the stone stairs well before the thugs, swiftly ascending to the stone chamber leading to the tavern storeroom. Through his enthralling spell Zanxsthy'll commanded Vry's to open the door. The Kisha-turned man touched a niche in the wall, and light burst from the floor and ceiling. The stone wall disappeared, revealing the hidden door to the storeroom. Zanxsthy'll pushed the fake wall open, striding through it. Vry's and Kydania followed, and all three of them swiftly exited the storeroom. They wound through the back halls of the Trident's wellspring, but as they reached the back door it opened. I hope that's not Jorgen, he thought, retaining a calm composure. A tall feminine figure darkened the doorway, blood-red cloak wrapped around her. Though her face was shrouded beneath the cloak's cowl, Zanxsthy'll glimpsed her vibrant green eyes. They were glowing and her irises swirled around her pupils. What? He fought back surprise. Wary, Zanxsthy'll shifted the gazes of Vry's and Kydania. He too averted his eyes, but still watched the cloaked figure. Though they were invisible, he could not let their eyes, or his, meet the newcomers. She passed without incident, disappearing down the winding halls. Now alone, he commanded Kydania and Vry's to step into the back alley. I better relinquish my control on the others, he thought, dismissing the enthralling spell on the thugs. Now to get to Jorgen. With that, Zanxsthy'll joined Vry's and Kydania in the alley and the three of them hurried toward Kydania's apartment. Nightfall had descended upon the city of Kildath when Zanxsthy'll finished manipulating the memories of all he had encountered. Luckily for him, all those who knew of Kydania were either at the altar of Chezarith or in the woman's apartment. Though he had subdued the thugs with ease, it had taken longer than he expected to rework their minds. He had to move Jorgen and the other thugs to various places in the Gegarin District before releasing his control over them. Once the thugs had been dealt with, Zanxsthy'll melded with Kydania and altered her memory of the day. He implanted an encounter between her and the man named Zanxsthy'll, a man who looked identical to the illusion Zanxsthy'll wore. After their brief meeting, she had relaxed in her apartment, leisurely enjoying the evening until Zanxsthy'll returned with a report of what he found at the Trident's wellspring. As Zanxsthy'll finished melding with Kydania, he commanded Rise to wait outside. He dismissed the illusion around Kydania, then repaired her clothes through transmutative magic, reknitting every torn fiber. The transmutative bond was only a temporary solution, so he used the Selendar to make it permanent. Once her clothes were whole, he dismissed the magic enthralling Kydania, as well as her illusion. "Well, that's very interesting," she said, moving to an end table which held a leather-bound journal. "Thank you for your thorough report," she added, opening the journal. "Cadden will appreciate it." "You're welcome," Zanxsthy'll said, smiling. "I must take my leave." Kydania nodded, not looking up from the journal. "Have a safe journey." Zanxsthy'll swiftly exited Kydania's apartment, joining Rise outside. Together they hurried to Ulvinaminar's shop through the still crowded streets. Despite the lateness of the day, Ulvinaminar's shop was open. Zanxsthy'll stepped inside to find Chrysilla straightening a dress on a mannequin. She spun toward the door, abruptly furrowing her brow. "You will have to come back tomorrow," she said, scowling. "We are closed." Eyes narrowed, she reached behind her back, removing something from her dress. "I am here to meet with Cadden," Zanxsthy'll said. Chrysilla drew a dagger from beneath her clothes. Zanxsthy'll had not noticed the concealed weapon when they first met. "My name is Zanxsthy'll." He hoped that would placate her. She stopped, eyeing him up and down. "I don't believe you," Chrysilla said. "You do not look like Zanxsthy'll." Perhaps I should have dismissed my illusion, Zanxsthy'll thought. He glanced back to the door, then the nearby windows. If he dismissed his illusion now he would undoubtedly be seen by anyone in the street. "I know I don't look like Zanxsthy'll," he said. "But I am he. I came to the shop earlier today with an old man claiming to be Lith. You told us to go away after mocking him." Chrysilla started. She glanced to the windows, then gestured to the shop's rear with her dagger. "To that wall," she said, "and don't try anything stupid." Zanxsthy'll complied, commanding Rise to follow him. Once near the back wall Zanxsthy'll and Rise both stopped and turned to Chrysilla. "Face the wall," she barked. "Hands behind your back." Zanxsthy'll complied once again, sighing. Bells rang behind him in a pattern that repeated several times. Intrigued, Zanxsthy'll glanced over his shoulder. Chrysilla stood at the door, tugging the string rigged to the door's bell. Amid the ringing, hurried footfalls sounded from the upper floors. A moment later, Ulvinaminar and old Zanxsthy'll dashed into the shop. Each looked ready for battle. "I think you have a problem, Cadden," Chrysilla said. "One of the men there claims to be that boy you sent to meet Kydania." Both Ulvinaminar and old Zanxsthy'll approached Zanxsthy'll, studying him and Rise. "Why don't you lock the door, Chrysilla?" Ulvinaminar said. "And drape the windows." Chrysilla hurriedly obeyed as old Zanxsthy'll neared Zanxsthy'll. "It's me, grandfather," Zanxsthy'll said. "And before you probe me for the truth, you should subdue the man beside me. I have him enthralled." Old Zanxsthy'll cocked an eyebrow. He exchanged a knowing glance with Ulvinaminar, and the tailor in disguise grabbed Rise and stared into his eyes. Noticing that the drapes were shut, Zanxsthy'll dismissed the illusions on both himself and Rise. Zanxsthy'll started, then grinned wide. "It is you," he exclaimed, embracing Zanxsthy'll tightly. When you didn't return, I feared the worst. What took you so long? Why don't you see for yourself? Zanxsthy'll said, glancing to Ulvina Minar. The shop's owner was probing Vraz and would undoubtedly discover the Keeshaw's true nature. It would be safe for Zanxsthy'll to let his grandfather relive his memories of the day. The enthralling spell would fade once old Zanxsthy'll melded with Zanxsthy'll, but that didn't matter. Ulvina Minar could deal with Vraz. As Zanxsthy'll's eyes met his grandfather's, he felt his mind opening. Every moment since leaving Ulvina Minar's sitting room flashed in Zanxsthy'll's mind. Every memory, every thought, every emotion replayed with vivid intensity, as if he lived it once again in a single instant. Amid each memory, Zanxsthy'll felt his grandfather's thoughts. The last image was of him stopping against the shop's back wall, and the melding faded. "Oh my," Zanxsthy'll muttered, stepping away from Zanxsthy'll. A haunted expression twisted his old face. Perplexed, Zanxsthy'll studied his grandfather. Why was he? An enraged growl filled the shop, and Zanxsthy'll spun. Ulvina Minar barked an incantation, mustering fiery magic. The words he used, however, were not the true magical tongue. His incantation was akin to those known among the mages of the human realm. A flaming blade coalesced in Ulvina Minar's hand, and he wildly swung it at Vraz, slashing and cutting with fury. Zanxsthy'll gaped as Vraz fell to the ground in pieces, his shape-shifting body collapsing in flame. Chrysilla screamed but abruptly muffled her wailing with her hands. Her once fierce eyes gazed horrified at the moldering corpse, whose burning flesh was becoming charred crimson scales. Anger seethed from Ulvina Minar's lips as he tossed aside his flaming blade. The fiery magic wisped away as it left his hands. Was that really necessary? Old Zanxsthy'll asked. Yes, Ulvina Minar growled and then turned away from the corpse. He moved to Chrysilla and grabbed her by the shoulders. He whispered something to her, his words causing her face to freeze with surprise. After a moment, Chrysilla turned away, moving through the shop and toward the stairs to the upper floors. Once she was gone, Ulvina Minar spoke. You should have killed him, he said to Zanxsthy'll. He was Lish Keeshaw. Zanxsthy'll pursed his lips disapprovingly. I agree with my grandson's course of action. This is war, Zanxsthy'll, Ulvina Minar said coldly. They are our enemy. Though he didn't say it, old Zanxsthy'll didn't share Ulvina Minar's opinion. Ulvina Minar sighed and shook his head. From what I gleaned from Vraz, you handled yourself well. I assume you melded with the thugs and Kydania. Surprising that she discovered your true nature, though. Zanxsthy'll nodded, briefly related his ordeal with the thugs, and then the specific information requested by Ulvina Minar before embarking on the test, all of which Zanxsthy'll had learned from probing Fitur and Vraz. He fulfilled all of your requirements, Zanxsthy'll said, folding his arms. He glanced to the corpse's charred scales. I am more than satisfied with the results. Ulvina Minar nodded. He's more than capable. A wonderful addition to our ranks. Ulvina Minar spoke of Zanxsthy'll as if he were not in the room. Now if you'll excuse me, I must clean this up, he said as he gestured to the corpse. Once Ulvina Minar left, Zanxsthy'll turned to Zanxsthy'll. I am very proud of you. You did something very difficult. You chose life over death. That is something I have not seen in a potential for a long time, a very long time. Old Zanxsthy'll became somber before speaking again. Perhaps you are worthy of more than just the mantle of Yuzazinshah. Your choices today set you apart from the others, he paused, glancing over his shoulder, and that must be acknowledged. What is he getting at? Before Zanxsthy'll could continue, Ulvina Minar returned, carrying a large garment bag. As the balding shop owner reached the charred corpse, Zanxsthy'll gestured to the hall leading to the stairs. He led Zanxsthy'll up the steps to the second floor before speaking again. I see you have the potential to become Ulksha, Zanxsthy'll whispered. Zanxsthy'll started. Ulksha. He had never considered himself worthy of such an honor. To be given that title was greater than all the glory in the world. You will have to undergo the rite, Zanxsthy'll said, coming to the next flight of stairs. And it is not something to be treated lightly. It is a refiner's fire. His words trailed off, and he set his jaw. But I warn you now, do not aspire to it. Any aspiration to become Ulkshaw will bring folly during the rite. Zanxsthy'll nodded. Once on the third floor, Zanxsthy'll removed a ring from his tunic. It contained a Rogulan crystal, dark blue and flecked with gold. Come, Zanxsthy'll. Let's return home. Zanxsthy'll uttered an incantation in the true magical tongue and his ring began to glow with golden light. Zanxsthy'll grabbed his grandfather's shoulder as the light spread. It would form a conjuration portal, transporting them halfway across the world and back to the frigid plains outside Zanxsthy'll. The end of Conspiracy in Kildath. Read more Untold Tales of Kalda in Thieves Among Nobles. Glossary. A glossary of names, people, places, objects, and terms found in Conspiracy in Kildath. Pronunciations and brief descriptions or definitions included. Agents of the Order, a group of mages within the Order of the Mages of Aleth. They typically operate alone or in small groups under the direction of the Order's Council for various assignments. They often are sent on espionage-related assignments. In times of war, agents are used as long-range scouts. During the rebellion against the Carther Empire, Lith Luzdam urged the Mages of Aleth to create a division within the Order capable of carrying out covert tasks, so the agents came into being. They acted as the eyes and ears of the rebellion. Agents often work with the League of Surveillors. Alathian Agent, Alathian C, Agents of the Order. Altar of Chesrith, Shearith, a secret grotto beneath the Trident's wellspring within the city of Kildath, used by the Veiled Scars as a secret hideout. Angath, Eingath, a powerful sorceress and the leader of a furtive organization that the Zanxsthy'll were duty-bound to hunt. Arpran magic, Arpiran, a type, or channel, or magic that can heal, regenerate, and prolong life. Barzion, Barzion, a type, or channel, of protective magic used primarily to create defensive barriers, but it can also restrain with inverted barriers. Kadim Silarim, Cahdim Silahrim, a famed couturier in Kildath, and the guise taken by the Zanxsthy'll, Ulvina Minar. Situri's army, Sature, an army from a fable who confronted a dragon and was stilled by the creature's gaze. City Watch, a civil organization within most cities devoted to keeping the peace. Their ranks include watchmen and discerners. Chrysala, Chla, assistant to Kadim Silarim. Elemental magic, the channel of magic capable of manifesting naturally occurring forces, including wind, water, fire, earth, ice, acid, magma, etc. Enhancing magic, a sub-channel of the manipulation channel of magic that bolsters physical prowess. Enthralling magic, a sub-channel of the manipulation channel of magic that affects the mind. Fitur, Fityar, a member of the Veiled Scars and one of Rai's bodyguards. Gegarin District, Gegarin, a prominent district in the city-nation of Kildath. One of the busiest districts in the entire city. Klindala, Isle of Klindahla, the largest island within of an island chain off the east coast of the Chaldean mainland. Ruins cover much of the islands, remnants of an extinct dynasty dating back to the Carther Empire. Few settlements exist on the island, consisting of pioneers from the nation of Maltin. Jorgen, Georgiahn, a member of the Veiled Scars. Kalda, Kaldah, the name of the world. Carther Empire, Carthar, an long-dead empire that once ruled the known world, but was topped by a rebellion led by the Lith Luzdam. Candish, an alias Zanxsthy'll intends to use. Khazar, Kzhr, an alias Zanxsthy'll intends to use. Kildath, a large city-nation located on the Chaldean mainland. Kinetic magic, a sub-channel with the manipulation channel of magic, that pushes and pulls on matter. Kydania, Kydana, a young woman with a spitfire wit who is an informant for the Zanxsthy'll, Ulvina Minar. Lish Kisha Lsh Kisha, the true name for a being who is half human and half red dragon, or with a significant amount of draconic lineage in their heritage. Lith Luzdom, Lith Luzdum, a common man turned general who rebelled against the Carther Empire, the father of Doran, the Mage King. Mage, any person who is trained to access the channels of magic. Maltin, a small nation along the eastern shores of the mainland, formerly the coastal range of the Carther Empire. Melding, an innate ability of one such as Zanxsthy'll and his kind to meld their mind with another's in a manner that allows sharing of thought, memory, and emotion. It is initiated by direct eye contact. Nodum's crown, Noh Dome, a mound in the Forbidden Lands. Potentials, a select group of young from Zanxsthy'll who seek to become Zanxsthy'll. Probing, an innate ability of one such as Zanxsthy'll and his kind to recall thoughts, memories and emotions of another. It is initiated by direct eye contact. Kisha, the true name for a being that is half human and half dragon. Dragon men is a loose translation some men of Kalda use. Rogulan crystal, Rogulan, a type of blue crystal native to Kalda with teleporting capabilities. It is exotic matter used to catalyze conjuration portals through time and space. Selndahr, a power beyond that of magic. Shakalda, the word for dragon in the draconic tongue. Siam, an incantation in the true magical tongue to muster a veil of invisibility. Takrin, a member of the Veiled Scars and one of Rai's bodyguards. Telekinetic magic, a sub-channel with the manipulation channel of magic, that pushes and pulls on matter. Tef Israel, any device capable of manifesting or channeling magic. Trident's Wellspring, a tavern in the Gegarin District used as a cover for the Veiled Scars hideout. True magical tongue, the proper and correct words of power used to access the channels of magic. Incantations of this tongue are swift, and staccato-like, and take a fraction of the time to speak versus the magical tongues used by the men and elves of Kalda. Men and elves cannot use this tongue to manifest the channels, as their minds are not capable of such feats. Ulvina Minar, and Zanxsthy'll assigned to the city of Kildath. Uksha, a title bestowed only upon the greatest of the Shah Kalda. It is obtained by undergoing the rite of the highest order. Zanxsthy'll, the underground city of the Zanxsthy'll, located in the farthest reaches of the Karda wastes, beyond the Black Mountains that separate the realms. Zanxsthy'll, a word that translates into one who spies. Zanxsthy'll are to watch and observe the human realm. They must stay their hand and not interfere with the doings of men, unless they discover remnants of the Chesarithian Empire. Only then can they act, but they must act in a manner that is covert. Veiled Scars, a gang of thugs led by Vrais, located in the Gegarin District of Kildath. Verdun Way, Virdon, a prominent road in the Gegarin District. Visak, a crude curse in the draconic tongue. Vrais, leader of the Veiled Scars, and a Kisha. Sutak Vermisra, Zutahk Vir an incantation in the true magical tongue to muster a sword of pure disintegration magic. Zanxsthy'll, an alias given to Zanxsthy'll by Ulvina Minar to use during his test in Kildath. Zanxsthy'll, a potential Zanxsthy'll, the grandson of Zanxsthy'll. Zatail, an alias Zanxsthy'll intends to use. Zatrin, an alias Zanxsthy'll intends to use. Zulthil, the grandfather of Zanxsthy'll, and Zanxsthy'll and Uksha. About the authors. Dan Zangari is the creator of the Legends of Kalda fantasy universe, a work in development since the early 1990s. He received a Bachelor's of Science in Aerospace Engineering from the University of Southern California and a master's degree in Systems Management. His love for science fiction and fantasy prompted the creation of this fantasy universe. When he's not writing, he enjoys reading, watching movies, spending quality time with family and serving in his local church congregation. Robert Zangari is the co-author of the various books which belong to the Legends of Kalda universe. He studied biomedical engineering at the University of Utah. However, his love for stories and storytelling took him down a different career path. When he's not writing, he enjoys spending time with his wife and daughters, playing video games, practicing martial arts and immersing himself in a good story. Other titles by Dan Zangari and Robert Zangari. For an up-to-date list of publications, visit the official Legends of Kalda website, http://www.legendsofkalda.com/books.html. Published by L.O.K. Publishing. Tales of the Amulet. Novels. A Prince's Errand. The Dark Necromancer. Elven Secrets. The Mage's Agenda. Treachery in the Kingdom. The Red Ruby. Companion Stories. A Thief's Way. The Last Bargainist. Mysterious Assassin. Return of the Elves. A Forgotten Hero. Guardians of Kalda. Untold Tales of Kalda. Defender of Stone. Conspiracy in Kildath. Thieves Among Nobles. Sorter of Mages. The Price of Penitence. Beneath the Frozen Wastes. Novels coming soon. A King's Fate. The Golden Dragons. Reign of the Black Knight. Companion Stories coming soon. A Knight's Honor. Crown of the Cavernlands. A Legend Reborn. Connect with the authors. Exclusive Readers Club. http://www.legendsofkalda.com/newsletter.html. LOK Publishing's official website. www.legendsofkalda.com. Twitter https://twitter.com/legendsofkalda. Official Facebook page https://www.facebook.com/legendsofkalda. We hope you've enjoyed this production of Conspiracy in Kildath by Dan Zangari and Robert Zangari. Text copyright 2019 by LOK Publishing, LLC. Production copyright 2023 by LOK Publishing, LLC. All rights reserved.